Hi, welcome everybody to Operation Parent and to our webinar today, Self-Harm and Our Youth. Our guest presenter is Dr. Tony Shepard. I just wanted to open the doors a little bit early and let everybody get in. I do want to ask if you could click on your GoToWebinar panel and go down to the question section and go ahead and put in your name and where you're from. And that's how we will be receiving questions from you. And after the webinar Dr. Shepard has completed his portion, we will go through and answer those questions. My name is Mary Beth Uberti, and I'm Director of Program Development here. So if you want to take a moment. Okay, here they come. Great. Taylor from Bloomington, Indiana. I see somebody from Pennsylvania, Melissa. Okay, so all right. Jessica from Washington. I see Jennifer. Okay, as you're coming in, just take a moment, go to this question section and put your first name in and where you're coming in from. Annie from Alabama, Diane from Ohio, Sandra from Maryland, Angie from Ohio State University Extension, Amanda, Washington, Brandy, Indiana, Kelly, Pennsylvania, Sarah, North Carolina, Lauren, Kentucky, Kansas, Christy from Minnesota. We have Emily from North Carolina, Gabby, Tennessee. This is great. Nadia from Oregon, Aaron, North Carolina, Shelby and Nikki from Clarion. I know where Clarion is. Monica from New Mexico, Jeff from Pennsylvania. Got some Portland, Oregon people. Susan from Alabama. This is great, guys. Thank you so much. And as a reminder, this is where you will put your questions as we go through the webinar. As you think of a question, go ahead and post it here. We will go ahead and answer all questions at the end of the webinar. All right, we are almost at the 2 o'clock mark. A few more people are coming in. Claudia from Arizona. All right, thank you so much for doing this, everybody. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and get our event started. Hold on here. Okay, so again, welcome everybody to Operation Parents webinar, Self-Harm and Our Youth, with our guest presenter, Dr. Tony Shepard. Just to go over, for those of you that are new to Operation Parent, we are a parent-driven organization. We're all parents here at Operation Parent. We are not counselors or psychologists. We are parents. We just really work to funnel the information down on what do parents need to know or caregivers need to know about the topic. And we work a lot with different providers throughout the community, and Dr. Shepard is one of them. So that is where Operation Parent comes in, providing education and resources to those raising teens and preteens. I'm going to go ahead and turn over the microphone to Michelle Massey, and she works with me on our webinars, and she is just going to go over some more about the GoToWebinar panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get into the content, I'm going to show you a few features of our GoToWebinar session that we're using today. So first, on your webinar control panel, you will see an orange tab with an arrow. This tab allows you to open and minimize the control panel. If you wish to view your screen without the control panel, just click on that orange tab to minimize it. For now, though, please click on the orange arrow tab and open up your control panel and view all the features with me. All attendees will be muted during the presentation today. We would, however, love to hear from you via the questions section. About halfway down the control panel, you will see this section. You will send both questions and comments here. The top panel will show you any questions you've already posted, and the light blue panel is where you can type your questions and send them directly to us. We highly encourage and love questions at any time during this live webinar. All questions will be answered by the end of the presentation. Just keep in mind, we might go over the 60-minute mark with the question and answer segment. So if you need to leave the webinar a few minutes or before the question and answers have ended, we totally understand. We have put together some really awesome handouts for you today. You're going to notice the handout section just below the question feature. Today's handouts are titled Facts for Families on Self-Harming, Self-Injury Information for Parents, Distraction Techniques, Self-Harm Helpful Websites, and then we've also put together a handout showing you the slides from today's presentation. About an hour prior to this webinar, you should have received an email containing the handouts. Today, though, if you would like to download the handouts while we're in session, just double-click on the handout to begin the download process. Please keep in mind, though, the handouts will only be available while we are in session. Once the webinar has closed, you will not be able to download the handouts from GoToWebinar. For all registrants, you will receive a follow-up email 24 hours after this live webinar. It will contain a link to the webinar recording and our survey, which we very much value your opinions. For those that are attending this live webinar today, you will also receive a certificate of attendance. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce a longtime friend and a great counselor in the Louisville area, Dr. Tony Shepard.
Thanks, Michelle. And I want to thank both Michelle and Mary Beth and Operation Parent for putting this together and for being around. They're a great resource, not only in our local community, but as we can see across the country. We have so many parts of the country represented. That's wonderful. I am Dr. Tony Shepard. I'm in private practice in Louisville, and I work primarily with older children, adolescents, and young adults. And I started getting interested in self-harm because I was seeing it all the time in my practice, and also working with schools and organizations like Operation Parent, hospitals, just being asked about it. And I started to educate myself and gather as much information as I could about it. And one thing I've learned about that, when you do that, it's very easy for you to become the go-to person. And I'm very glad to have that information and to be able to share it today. So I'm going to jump right in and get started. There are, I will point out on my website, which is listed there on the slide, there are resources there. We have a page on suicide and self-harm under our Learn tab. So if you wanted to check that out, we have some links to information on there for parents and youth to use. Okay. I do specialize in group therapy, hence the name of my practice, and we do treat and see a lot of self-harm in our groups. So it's something that has been on the rise. I think it's still on the rise, and it's definitely something that's prevalent with youth. So hopefully we can shed some light on that today. So our learning objectives, we'll look at an overview of some of the forms of self-harm and the motivations for self-harm. Hopefully we'll gain a greater knowledge of risk factors and other diagnostic categories that can increase the likelihood for self-harm. We will consider the role of online communities, media, social media, and family in recovery process. And we'll learn a little bit about parents' role in prevention and recovery. We'll talk a little bit about a multi-systemic approach, which kind of involves all the different systems in which kids operate: school, faith communities, clubs, online, sports, all those different types of things. So just to get some definitions, we do want to talk about suicide and self-harm are separate but related issues. So we will spend a minute on some definitions. Self-harm or non-suicidal self-injury is a broad class of behaviors defined by direct, deliberate, socially unacceptable destructions of destruction of one's own body tissue without the intent to die. So by definition, non-suicidal self-injury or self-harm is separate from suicide. So the person typically, when they are engaging in that deliberate, we say socially unacceptable because there are some things like body piercing, tattooing, things like that can lapse over into seeming like self-harm, but usually it's viewed as a socially unacceptable behavior. The person typically, when they're engaging in the self-harm, does not have any intent to die. So that's part of this issue being separate from suicide. Suicide, when we look at suicide, suicide obviously is a death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with any intent to die. A suicide attempt is defined as a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with any intent to die as a result. A suicide attempt may or may not result in injury. And that definition is from the Center for Disease Control. So you can see just from those two slides that the intent to die is one of the critical things. Typically, youth engaging in self-harm don't have any intent to end their lives because of the self-harm. So they are related but separate issues. We know that the longer somebody engages in self-harm, the higher their risk of suicide it goes up. So there is a kind of desensitization to harming yourself that can increase the likelihood of a suicide attempt. But we do want to be careful that we don't assume that those engaging in self-harm are suicidal. Kids know the difference, and they're fairly sensitive to being kids who are engaging in self-harm are fairly sensitive to adults assuming that they're trying to end their life. So forms of self-harm involving the skin, cutting, using any kind of sharp object to cut the skin, carving, similar to cutting. It is a form of cutting, but that's where you put words or symbols into the skin. Typically that is a little deeper sometimes, and a little, obviously when you're carving words or symbols into your skin, you may be going deeper. Burning using hot objects. Sometimes burning involves erasers. So younger children particularly will use erasers to cause burns on their arm. Biting, picking, or interfering with wound healing. Punching oneself or objects and then inserting objects under the skin or inserting objects under nails, things like that. The two most prevalent are cutting and carving. Those are the most prevalent forms. So other forms of self-harm: hitting or beating the self, head banging, hitting walls or other hard objects, having others cause pain, daring other people to hit you, self-tattooing or piercing can lapse over into a form of self-harm, and then pulling out hair. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these. These are very rare forms of self-harm: genital mutilation, auto-cannibalism, which is eating the flesh, embedding, inserting objects under the skin and even into the muscle, and then amputation. Those forms of self-harm tend to be seen more in prison settings or residential type settings for very severely disturbed or impaired youth. So risk factors, when we look at risk factors for self-harm, any presence of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, would raise risk. Neglect or parental indifference. So either being neglected by parents or feeling that parents are indifferent and aren't really involved. Family violence, particularly parental impulsive violence. So if kids are exposed to parents who fly off the handle really easily. Relational factors, separation and loss, poor quality of attachment with caregivers, that's similar to the neglect or parental indifference. Single parent households, obviously there we're not criticizing single parents, but we're saying that in single parents households there may be less attention to go around, and there may be more of a factor of feeling neglected, or feeling that one's not getting enough attention. And then parental illness, particularly parental mental illness. So all those things can get in the way of the stronger relationships, and those things those are risk factors that raise a child's likelihood of engaging in self-harm. Other risk factors, more on an individual level about the person, emotional reactivity and intensity. So kids tend to react very strongly and very intensely to emotional material. They also may have feelings of hopelessness, isolation, and loneliness, problems with anger. Substance abuse. Substance abuse is something that not only makes non-suicidal self-injury more likely and more dangerous, it also is a huge factor with suicide risk. So when you combine substances with suicide risk, that's particularly dangerous. Engaging in reckless and risk-taking behaviors, you see a higher prevalence of that with kids who engage in self-harm, and also prevalence of negative emotions. And then, as we'll see, social and problem-solving deficits really are a factor here. Kids tend to engage in the self-harm when they're unable to solve problems, particularly social problems in relationships. So this is really, I think this is really important. This is research, I think, from 2014 or 15. And these researchers studied parent-child relationships among chronic self-harmers. And some things that they discovered were that parents of chronically self-harming children were found to communicate the following: invalidation and minimization. So not validating feelings, emotions, things like that, or minimizing those. Criticism, so criticizing the actions of the young person. Punishment and distress. So also, not only were they found to communicate these types of things in their interactions more often, parents of chronically self-harming teens tended to allow conflict with their teens to become highly aversive, meaning pretty intense. The conflict in those relationships got to a really high level, and then they also tended to de-escalate that conflict much less than normal. So there's kind of a toxic nature in some of these relationships. So there's also research that shows that kids who engage in non-suicidal self-injury, there are a couple of deficits that show up. One, deficits in accurately reading emotional cues from others. Now, this is not autism. This is not on that level. But they tend to misread emotional cues. They may miss the fact that people are being very supportive of them. They might miss empathy cues, that people are actually trying to relate to them and connect with them. They also have deficits in accurately conveying their own emotions through expression. So they don't come across in the way that they intend to. So you can see how this could damage relationships. It could hinder the formation of healthy relationships, but it could also damage relationships. And if you look back at some of those risk factors, a lack of strong supportive relationships is one of the risk factors. So you can kind of see how these things start to interact with each other and play together. So the course of NSSI, non-suicidal self-injury, this is really important because most mental health professionals and parents want this to be something that, well, first of all, we don't ever want it to happen. But when it does, we want it to go away. We don't want it to resurface. Unfortunately, it is rather cyclical. So you see the diagram here. You have a stressor that happens up there on the top. You engage in non-suicidal self-injury. Your parents take you to get help and you have a period of recovery. Then another bigger stressor comes along. You tend to relapse and then go into a phase of recovery. So this really is best conceptualized as a coping strategy. It's not a good one. It's a maladaptive one, but it is a coping strategy. So it can last for weeks, months, or years. Now, when we say months to years, we don't mean continuous. We mean that there can be relapses along the way where you revert back to the behavior. Episodes can be triggered by stress. If you think about it, we all have maladaptive coping strategies. That might be overeating ice cream, which is one of mine. It could be drinking. It could be anger episodes. It could be, we have casinos here. It could be going to the casino and blowing your paycheck. So if we think about it as similar to those types of things, when we hit a period of stress, we can revert back to unhealthy coping strategies. And that's definitely how self-harm tends to work. So two broad categories of motivation. One is sort of regulating the internal environment, so seeking a release from internal emotions. It's coping with your own feelings. It's to stop bad feelings, to stop feeling nothing, numb or empty, to feel something even if it's pain, to cope with depression, anxiety, sadness, frustration, anger. Sometimes there's a need to punish yourself. Because there's an endorphin release when people engage for some people who engage in self-harm, it can create a feeling of relaxation. So one category is that internal regulation. The other one is to get something from our external environment or to regulate our external environment. Avoiding school, work, or other activities, avoiding being with people, avoiding punishment or consequences, to get attention, to get a reaction from someone, control of a situation to get someone to act in a certain way, even to get help, a cry for help. So a lot of times we sort of chalk the second one up to, well, it's just attention seeking or they're being manipulative. Well, if that's true, there's a breakdown in communication. There's a breakdown in that person being able to get what they need or what they perceive that they need. So I prefer to think about it as a problem with problem solving and communication rather than the person just describing it as they're being manipulative or they're trying to get attention. I say that if that's your only way, your best way of getting attention, we need to help you learn some other ways to get the attention that you feel like you need. So initial reactions from parents, I'm not going to read the quotes there in purple, but those are actual quotes I've heard from parents. When parents discover that their child is self-harming, it's not uncommon to feel any of these things here that are listed: shock, denial, anger, frustration, empathy, sympathy, sadness, guilt, fear and panic, loss of control, a sense of isolation. These are very normal feelings that parents feel. So let's talk about, because suicide is a related behavior, let's talk about for just a minute about some of the components of suicide risk. One important thing is about suicide risk. I do want. Can we go back to that previous slide, Mary Beth? Just really quick. Some components that we look at with suicide risk are thoughts. That is what it sounds like. It's thoughts of suicide. Those are fairly common among youth. We don't know exactly how common, but we know that if you ask teens at any point during your adolescence, have you ever thought of ending your life? I think it's between 50 and 75% will say yes, that at some point that thought's crossed my mind. At that point, we want kids to be talking about that. We want them to be opening up about that and not just sitting in alone with that. Plans are when someone starts to plan how they might end their life. and that definitely takes a step into something that's more serious. Intent is when you start to develop the intent to follow through on the plan, and that does get to be very dangerous. That's when we're looking at a more restrictive environment for that young person, hospital, more intensive therapy, something to really intervene with that. Suicidal behaviors are things like rehearsing for suicide or gathering the necessary items to follow through on the plan. Okay, we can now go ahead there. So it's very important, it's okay to talk to your child if you have a sense that they might have some suicidal thoughts. It's a myth that bringing it up is going to put the idea in their head. Suicide is something that gets talked about fairly readily in our society nowadays. We have celebrity suicides quite often, and so it's something that's already out there. And so I think that idea that we're going to put ideas in their head is a false one, and the research supports that. Respectful curiosity is what it sounds like. It's just being respectfully curious of what's going on with your child. It's okay to talk about suicidal thoughts. I tell kids that I meet with that I want to hear if they're having suicidal thoughts, because the research shows that the more they talk with someone about it, the less powerful it is, and they're not sitting alone with it. And we want to listen, try to understand and validate. We want to go against what that research shows, where parents tend to communicate this minimization and invalidation of kids. Downspeak versus upspeak is just a way of, instead of going up on the end of our sentences, going down. It creates a more calm tone. So, I think that one thing to remind ourselves of is if your child is dealing with these issues, or one or both of these issues, that there are periods of crisis, definitely, but there's time between crises. There are times that kids aren't self-harming and that they're not suicidal, and that's definitely when we can develop some of those positive coping skills. So let's take a look at that. So when we talk about building coping skills, here are a few things that we want to look at with that: maintaining a positive focus, developing what's called resilience, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Learning stress management, improving distress tolerance. So improving your ability when things get stressful or you're in a period of distress, that you can tolerate that and have the confidence to feel like you can solve problems. And then increasing self-regulation skills, just increasing a person's ability to manage themselves, particularly their emotions. So when we look at protective factors with regard to both self-harm and suicide, internal protective factors, the ability to cope with stress, religious beliefs, and frustration tolerance. More external to the person, responsibility to children. Most children don't have children, but beloved pets or friends, positive therapeutic relationships, and then feeling like a person has social supports. Those are all protective factors. So positivity, having a positive focus in life is something that is quite powerful. And it's something that I think I know I can struggle with from time to time. But looking at the world, from a glass half full rather than a glass half empty perspective. Kids who struggle with depression typically particularly struggle with that. In our group room, I put a few things that we can use that could be used in group or out of group. The positivity meter. We used to have a positivity meter on the wall. It was not an actual meter that measured anything, but we would change it from time to time to just reflect back to the kids what the overall tone in the room was. Positive emotion jars. We have little jars that are empty, but they have positive emotions written on them, and just a way to communicate that sometimes we need a little jar of happiness or assertiveness or confidence or whatever. Just sharing a small victory or a high point, just celebrating the little things in life that we get right. What's going right? Just looking at, we tend to talk more about what's going wrong in our lives. What's going right? Solution-focused brief therapy scaling is something we use with our youth. And with our kids, and that's just simply as 0 to 10, maximize the positive forces and minimize those negative forces. Thought flipping is taking a negative thought and flipping it over, and this is an activity that we do quite a bit in group.
Hey, Tony, it's Mary Beth. Real
Yeah.
quick, your vocal, your audio cut out for a little bit. Could you go back over solution-focused brief therapy scaling, because that's when it went out?
Sure, yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Solution-focused brief therapy scaling is a 0 to 10 scale, and it's basically, it lets you kind of rate where you are with any given thing. How's your depression? How's your anxiety? How are you doing? How's your week going? Things like that. And then we often talk about what forces are pulling you toward 0 and what forces are pulling you toward 10, and how do we maximize those positive forces and minimize the negative forces. So thought flipping, here's a little slide on thought flipping. We've got I'm ugly, nobody likes me, my teacher hates me. These are actual quotes I've heard from kids. I hate school. Today is going to be awful. I hate myself. I'm a bad kid. You know, I hate school. Sometimes that's when we hear a lot. You know, and the question we ask is, okay, so tell us one positive thing about school. Sometimes the only thing they can find is we have pizza on Fridays. Okay, fine. That's a positive thought about school. My teacher hates me. Is that really true? You know, a lot of times if you start to dig a little bit, you find out that that's not true. So we learn to kind of flip these thoughts over. I'm ugly. Find something you like about your appearance, rather than these general broad statements that tend to take us in a negative direction. So I think one thing that's really, really important, if we look back to those risk factors and we consider that a lot of those risk factors have to do with family relationships, then one of the things we want to do to reduce the risk of self-harm is we want to improve family relationships. We want to facilitate better communication. We want to increase openness, knowing that these are young people who may not be completely open with parents and families, but we want them to be as open as possible. We also want to improve their ability, not only the person's ability, but the family ability to regulate emotion. Not that we get rid of emotion, we just learn how to manage it in the healthiest way possible. Peers, you know, improving peer relationships, introducing positive support, improved emotion regulation, so learning how to react in a more measured, thoughtful way to situations that come up with peers. Reading accurately, reading emotional cues accurately, and then accurately conveying one's own feelings. So getting better at communicating how you are feeling to other people. These are all things that if we look back at those risk factors, we're addressing those things and helping the person to develop better relationships. So collaboration and planning, you know, this is kind of the multi-systemic idea where we work with whomever the young person and their family will give us permission to. So home, we work with families, we work with immediate and extended families. Sometimes we collaborate with schools, so we We collaborate with school counselors and teachers and things like that, friends, online communities, work settings, religious communities, other mental health professionals, medical professionals, and case managers that might be working with kids, whether in the home or in the community or whatever. So those are all, I think that we don't want to involve anybody that we don't have permission to involve, but those are all categories of people who could be really helpful and supportive of a young person who's struggling. Support in school. A few things that we see that can be helpful with kids with not only with self-harm or suicidal ideation, but with depression, with really a lot of mental health presenting issues, is having a safe adult with whom to talk. That's a really important thing that the research shows, is that kids who struggle with self-harm and suicide, one thing that can make the difference for them is having a safe adult that they feel like they can talk to. So identifying somebody at school that they can go to that can be their support person. Sometimes modification of workload is important. If kids don't manage stress well, particularly if they also struggle with learning issues or ADHD or something that might impede their ability to complete work, sometimes modification of workload is helpful. Support in practicing healthy coping skills. It can make a huge difference to have an ally at school, particularly with elementary and middle school kids, to have somebody who is able to support them in practicing healthy coping skills. Having parents on board, knowing what those healthy alternatives to self-harm are. And then protecting self-esteem. Self-esteem is a huge issue here. So we want to make sure we're safeguarding the person's self-esteem and their sense of self-worth. Parental monitoring. Parents need guidance on how to monitor their young people. The following things can do more harm than good a lot of times: room searches, strip searches, offering incentives for no harm, punishing self-harm or suicidal behavior, and then threats and ultimatums. We try to avoid those things. We try to be more collaborative. With self-harm, it's often not recommended that we try and remove sharp objects, just because the idea is that the person is going to find other things to use to self-harm. With suicide, that's different. We do practice means restriction, which is trying to remove those more dangerous objects. Healthy monitoring. Adolescents report that having a non-judgmental adult to talk to can help curb these behaviors that we're talking about. The best monitoring is done through direct, honest communication, respectful curiosity, saying, hey, I want to know what's going on with you, I want to help. And then there are cases where search type things might be necessary. Parents might feel like they need to do that. I think typically when those can be negotiated and the young person can provide at least some degree of consent for that to happen, that is ideal. And that's where I think sometimes family therapists and things like that can come into play and help families to negotiate and communicate in a healthy way around those kind of things. So I do like to sort of normalize this struggle that parents often find themselves in with teens. The arrows up there, teens are going in one direction and parents are going in the other direction. The quote here, teens want more and more freedom and parents want to hang on to control. So that sets up a struggle, kind of a tug of war. And so there are times when professional help can be needed to balance those things. I tell teens, it's your job to try and get out the door as fast as you can, and it's your parents' job to cling on to you, wondering if they've taught you everything you need to know about the scary world. And I think there's some truth in that. So a lot of times what we see when things get really out of hand with that is we see an exaggeration of a normal process. So I think that does frame it kind of in a developmental perspective for both parents and teens. So trauma is a big part of this. We have a list here of possible traumas. We noticed earlier that abuse was definitely a risk factor. I think that with trauma, we're seeing a lot of these things that are listed here contributing to trauma. So trauma is something that we definitely have to be aware of, and we have to treat. We have to treat trauma with therapy. So negative replacement behaviors, I think these used to be more controversial. These are replacement behaviors for self-harm. So what are you going to do in place of self-harm? There's some research to show that some of these things can be very helpful. Maybe not as permanent solutions, but as a transition away from the self-harm. So using a red marker or paint or even corn syrup with food coloring to simulate blood, applying ice packs or holding frozen objects. Obviously, those that could cause injury need to be done with caution. Applying a temporary tattoo and scratching it off with your fingernails. Writing about a self-harm episode, applying cooling cream to your skin, snapping a rubber band, eating hot or spicy foods, and then attaching movie makeup scars to the skin. So educating peers, I think it's really important that young people know peers can be a source of immense support. Youth need to know their limits, and so you need to tell a trusted adult if you feel a peer is going to harm themselves. You can be a friend, but if you get to the point where the person is persistent, you need to get help. There's a great app called A Friend Asks that's developed by the Jason Foundation, and you can Google the Jason Foundation or look on your app store for A Friend Asks, and that's a very valuable app for kids to have because it has a direct link to Get Help Now, which is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You know, peer support, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but never promise to keep a secret. Telling a trusted adult is not a bad thing. If you feel like somebody's in danger for taking their own life or harming themselves, tell somebody. Supporting friends, you know, encouraging young people to be there for each other. You know, don't be afraid to ask. And that goes for parents too. You know, never underestimate the power of a friendship or a relationship. Being there matters. Encourage the person, share healthy resources. Online communities and support. The internet gets a lot of bad press, but you know, it can be a source of support. There are self-harm support groups on social media. A lot of those are difficult. It's really difficult to tell which ones are safe and reputable. So there wasn't one on either of those three platforms listed that I felt comfortable recommending. So some of the pitfalls of online support, you know, unhealthy relationships can form. This is something we definitely want to monitor. There can be misinformation depending on who puts that information up there. Triggering images or content. So writing in detail that's posted about self-harm episodes or triggering images of people's self-harm. There are sites that glorify and condone self-harm and suicide. And then unmonitored sites, sites where there's nobody in charge or nobody with an adult brain who's in charge can be dangerous. So what do I look for when I'm looking at online support? I want to know, is the site moderated? If it's a discussion board or something like that, who moderates it? Who chooses what gets to stay up and who enforces the rules? You know, by whom? Is it a college kid, or is it a mental health professional? Those are very different things. Does it have trigger alerts? And trigger alerts are when there's potentially triggering content. There are alerts that say, hey, this could trigger you. This could trigger thoughts of self-harm or suicide. What are the community rules? Is it for support and encouragement? And then is pro-NSSI or suicide content allowed? Is it allowed to post things that glorify either of those things? And if so, that's a problem. Social media, some of the things that can come from, good things that can come from social media: contact with other people, social support, encouragement, a sense of not being alone. And then those in rural areas can really have some important connections through social media. Websites that I recommend that are good, reputable sources of information. To Write Love on Our Arms is one that is targeted more at teens, and very edgy, positive messages that really resonate with teens nowadays. The founder is a former executive or employee of one of the athletic brands, I believe. So he has that knack for creating cool, edgy designs. American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is a good one. The Jason Foundation, started by a father in Nashville whose son took his own life many years ago. Save Suicide Voices, Suicide Awareness Voices of Education. And then the Trevor Project is particularly targeted toward LGBTQ youth. So I guess, I come to a point where I say to parents, don't try to do this alone. Seek professional help. In my role as a psychologist, I have friends and colleagues and neighbors who come to me and say, hey, this is going on with my child. Do you think we should see somebody? And I've learned that my answer typically is, hey, if you thought enough about it to come see me and talk to me about it, then yes, you should see somebody. As a mental health professional, I've been both of my children. I'm a parent. I have 2 children, and they've been in counseling, and I'm aware that I'm outing them on this webinar, but I don't think either of them would have a problem with that, because I think they have found it helpful in their lives. So I really do encourage parents to not try and navigate something as emotional and as potentially scary and everything like this alone.
Okay. Thank you, Tony, so much.
Yeah.
Great information. We have some time here for questions. I'm going to go through a few slides first, and then, but while we're doing that, please, if you have any questions, go put it into the questions section, and we'll address them in a few moments. Just for everybody's information, the next webinar is Understanding and Preventing Youth Suicide. This is going to be on Monday, April 29th. Again, this is going to go more into depth than just what Dr. Shepard talked about. We're going to have, hopefully I'll say his name right, Dr. Steve Katsikas, thank you, from Spalding University on to do that presentation and talking about youth suicide. Also, just know that Operation Parent does provide community presentations. I go out into the community at schools, business conferences, counselor conferences, talking about things from social media world, drugs and alcohol. So give that a thought. Please keep in touch with Operation Parent on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Continue to sign up for our newsletter, purchase our parent handbook for more information, and then just continue to attend our webinars. For those of you that have not ever seen one of our parent handbooks, we have different varieties. We have an elementary version available in English, Spanish, and a Christian edition. And then also the middle and high school, which is a more robust handbook, covers over 40 topics related to the preteen and teen cultural issues. So you can order them on our website at operationparent.org. So right now, I'm just going to quickly scan back and turn on Michelle's microphone. And Michelle, are there any questions? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Shepard, have you found statistics telling us if males or females are more likely to self-harm?
I think if you look at, well, first of all, I don't know that we know. I think that we're still figuring out exactly the demographics of this. If you look historically at the numbers, it has always been more prevalent with females, but that a lot of that information is when we were just looking at cutting. I think males tend to engage in more, while they do engage in cutting, they tend to engage in more banging and beating types of behaviors, burning, things like that. So I'm not sure that we can really answer that question right now. I think it's safe to say that there are many, many, many more males who engage in self-harm than we originally thought when we sort of conceptualized this as cutting.
Gotcha. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
When should a school counselor require a suicide assessment on a student? Any student who voices having suicidal thoughts, or only if there's a plan in mind?
There's a great tool, and there's a great tool called the Columbia Suicide Risk Assessment Scale, and it is one of the evidence-based tools for determining the level of risk. And I typically like to use something like that to guide me on. It's actually color coded so that it's yellow, orange, red, and the red is typically where you would call for an evaluation. I think with a school, different school districts have different policies on that. So I think you obviously have to follow your district's policy. I think overall, I prefer to, if somebody has a plan, I want to really assess for intent. I think if it's thoughts, if people are mentioning thoughts, we can jump too quickly to an evaluation and shut them down. So the research, I think, would say that if somebody's just having thoughts of suicide and there's clearly no plan or intent, then you wouldn't. Obviously, you have to follow your school district policy. And then I really like to use something like the Columbia. And if you Google Columbia suicide risk assessment, that will come up. And that's actually free. That's something, and there is a school counselor version and training module on the website. You can completely train yourself for free in that instrument using
That is awesome.
yeah. So
Thank you so
it's the
much for that additional
lighthouseproject.org.
resource.
The lighthouseproject.org is where you find the Columbia instrument and all the training.
The Lighthouse, what's that called again?
Lighthouseproject.org.
Okay, lighthouseproject.org.
Outstanding. Thanks, Dr. Shepard, for that additional resource, too.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from a parent.
Okay.
My daughter writes on her hands. Is this the beginning of self-harm?
I don't think so. It amazes me how many kids will draw and color and write on their arms. I don't know of any correlation there. Obviously, I would I pay attention and see if it does escalate into anything else. But I think that honestly, it's just something that they do. I noticed an actual young adult server at a restaurant recently, and he was taking orders on his arm. So it's something I think with young people.
And as a parent, both of my kids used to write on their hands, their back of their hands, on their palms, and sometimes it was homework assignments, but other times it was just words that,
Sure.
for whatever reason, or just color in as boredom. Unfortunately,
Yep.
in a class,
Yep.
yeah, I've seen some pretty wild colorations on my children's hands, and they're not children
Right.
anymore, but I've
Right.
experienced that.
Yeah, and I'm not
Ditto
aware of
here.
any correlation there, but that's a really good question. That's something to
Yeah.
definitely pay attention to.
This next question is good too. In your practice, are you noticing an average onset in terms of age?
My practice, we don't, we don't see a lot of our elementary school kids engaging in self-harm. I'm not really sure why that is. But I have trained, our school district here in Louisville is one of the, I think it's in the top 20 in the country. It's a very large urban school district. And I've trained all of the counselors at elementary, middle, and high school level. And I actually did it several times over the course of several years. And the number of elementary school counselors who are now reporting it, seeing it in their schools, the increase is astounding. I mean, I remember doing it back in the mid 2000s and having people raise their hands, and maybe a fourth of the audience raised their hands. I think the last time I did it, 3/4 raised their hands. So I think there are younger and younger kids. We tend to not see it for some reason, like I said, in our elementary school kids, but I know that the age of onset is fairly young. I think the most common age of onset is middle school age.
Okay, and in the same line of thoughts, what about younger children who might be exposed to conversations at school or
Hmm.
behaviors that they hear from older children?
Hmm.
For example, a 6-year-old likely not knowing what they are doing, maybe scratching themselves when they get mad.
Hmm.
When asked about it, they report they saw someone at school doing it. How should this be handled?
There's actually a term for that, social contagion, and it's where you learn about something from someone else doing it, and that is definitely a big factor in this. I think that you want to. I think it's less important where they learned it, and more important that we help them to figure out an alternative way of handling their anger. So essentially, they're taking their anger out on themselves. So what I would do is help the child to identify, what else can you do when you feel angry that doesn't hurt yourself, and engage with that. We know that social contagion um, is a factor, and we do what we can to control it. But I think we also have to realize that kids are going to be exposed to it. They're going to be exposed to it online, in real life, in the classroom, wherever. So I think it's more important to see that as an opportunity to help them learn an alternative coping skill.
What are some of the best coping strategies students can use when they are at school and they feel
Mhm.
like self-harming?
Well, I think going back to having a safe person to touch base with, I think is important. Um, Relaxation skills. I think it depends on what the person is facing. If it's a bullying issue, getting away from the situation. I think that's where it can be really important to have that safe person to go and kind of help. But relaxation type skills, mindfulness type skills where you're learning to kind of be present in the moment and calm yourself, those are important. Sometimes kids can have, I've had kids who have had a motivational quote or a picture of somebody important to them that they can look at, and just seeing that can help kind of put them in a more positive mindset.
So you're saying giving them lots of tools and resources ahead of time and so that they
Hmm.
can lean on one of those.
I'm big
Makes
on
sense.
collaborating with kids, in terms of saying, hey, when you have these urges, what is something that helps take your mind off of it? And then if that doesn't work, giving them some options. There's a great handout there's a Cornell University suicide self-harm website, and it's in the materials. If you Google Cornell University self-harm, it'll come up. There's a wonderful handout in there called Alternatives to Self-Harm and Distraction Techniques. And I haven't found a better list of just alternatives, coping strategies. So a lot of times I will present that to a young person and say, hey, let's pick a few. Let's identify a few from this amazing list that Cornell University put together, and help you make a short list that you can keep with you. You can keep it on your phone or whatever, so that you have a list of things that you're going to do as alternatives to the self-harm.
That's right. And we were able to include that handout for parents.
Oh,
So
great. I
parents
see
will
it.
have that
Yep, I see it.
resource. And you're
Distraction
right, it
techniques.
is exceptional.
Yeah, it's really good. Mm-hmm.
Our next question comes from a parent.
Huh?
Is there a treatment modality that seems to work best for treating self-harm that a parent should look at? Professional resources, especially if CBT hasn't previously been a helpful route with
Mm-hmm.
this particular child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the ones that we rely on a lot is DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. Um, DBT focuses on mindfulness and self-regulation and things like that. So there are a lot of principles in DBT that I think are really helpful. Um, so that's typically, the research is supporting DBT in that, probably a little bit more so than CBT.
Okay.
Mhm.
Would you mind to repeat the scale that you mentioned earlier?
The solution focused brief therapy
Yes.
scale. Yeah, it's really just solution focused brief therapy is a kind of an approach that was popular, probably most popular back in the 80s and 90s, years ago. But one thing that kind of stuck around from solution focused brief therapy is a 0 to 10 scale. And it really just offers, an overall way to rate something. So somebody comes in and says, I'm really angry. Well, where is that on a 0 to 10 scale? 0 being no anger at all, 10 being lots of anger. Well, it's about an 8. You know, um, you can really use it with a lot of different things, and I think what are even urges to self harm. I feel I can't get self harm off my mind. Well, how strong is the urge? It's about a 7. you know and so you can then talk about, well, what are things that could reduce your thoughts of self-harm, moving you more toward a 0, and what are things that are increasing your urges for self-harm, and how do we help you focus on the things that are bringing you down that scale rather than bringing you up that scale. So that's kind of how we use that. It's just a way to sort of put a number on things, um, kind of a quick way to get a feel for things, and then it opens up a discussion. It kind of structures the discussion so that you're talking about, um, the factors that are bringing you, the factor, sort of really it's a way of kind of talking about your protective factors, which would be the things that are bringing you down the scale, versus your risk factors, and those are the things that are pushing you more in the direction of self-harm.
Another excellent resource. What are some of the first signs of self-harm?
Things that, I urge parents to look for, is kids wearing. I mean, obviously, kids wearing, trying to cover up. You know, wearing, this time of the year here. It's chilly outside, so we're all wearing long sleeves and things like that. But if they're not wanting to, if they're being secretive and they're wearing, it's summertime and they're wearing sweaters, that kind of thing. Spending, lots of time alone withdrawing, in their room, wherever. Obviously, finding objects laying around, um, things like that. Um, Secretiveness.
Okay, Dr. Shepard, the questions are still coming in, so you're touching people here. We have a couple more.
Can I just interject? Just
Yes.
for anybody that's paying attention to time, we're just beyond the 3 o'clock time. If you need to sign off, we're going to continue to record this until probably 10 after. Hopefully get through the rest of the questions, and that will be part of the recording that will go out tomorrow. So feel free to to leave the webinar if you need to, but understand that the questions will be completely on the recording. Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, great. Are there any connections between social media use and self-harm?
I don't know if we really have gotten that far in terms of understanding things. I know that we do know that the social contagion, like I talked about earlier, with learning it from other people, I mean, social media definitely has been part of that getting out there. In terms of, I think that anytime you're on social media, you open yourself up to some risk factors like bullying, things like that. So I think that eventually, I think we'll discover that probably it is a factor. Um, I think that I think that social media is not going away, and I think there can be some protective factors there. I think that having those connections, it is one of the ways that young people stay connected to each other. Um, so I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think that it is a factor. I'm a big proponent of teaching kids how to use social media responsibly. So, if there are triggering things on there, somebody posts, we've had situations where young people in our practice are getting triggered by other people's posts. So, being responsible and maybe muting that person or blocking that person if they continue to post, pro non-suicidal self-injury stuff on their social media account, then maybe it's time to not be friends with them on that platform.
Our next question is from a concerned parent.
Uh-huh.
I have a child that denies that he has a desire to take his life, but states that he thinks about it. I think
Mm.
he downplays it because he knows that it's taboo.
It's possible. I think each situation is so individualized that I usually tell parents, if you have concerns about that, then take your child to see somebody who's more trained in that area and can help you determine the level of risk. It is always possible that I think that one thing that is definitely true is that kids don't tell parents everything. Those relationships are complicated, so there are things that kids don't tell their parents because they don't want them to worry, they don't want to burden them, they don't want to do this or that they might open up to a professional about. So it's possible. It's possible that there's a minimization there.
What steps do you recommend for families and schools to take to prevent self-harm?
I think engaging with kids, trying to build those positive relationships as much as possible, uh, open communication as much as possible. I mean, with the understanding that especially teenagers aren't always that open, but giving them opportunities to open up, letting them know you care, following up on any kind of problems that you sense. If you sense that there's a problem, following up on that and not being afraid to reach out for professional help if you feel like you need it. For schools, I think controlling bullying is huge. Bullying is a huge factor in non-suicidal self-injury. Creating a more positive school environment, not letting kids be isolated, not letting kids have time alone during the school day, and being I think overall for schools, just being friendly to mental health issues, realizing that somebody's psychological health and psychological problems are just as important and legitimate as a broken leg or diabetes.
Yeah, that's a great point. Dr. Shepard, if a child keeps mentioning that they want to die and they don't want to exist, does this mean that they are really thinking of suicide, or could they just be trying to get extra attention?
Well, it could be both. I do find that kids, I don't know, I think maybe this is something we can thank the internet for, is that kids do, they are quick to sort of cynically throw out, oh, I just want to die, or kill me now, things like that. It's become a part of the way they talk. So, I mean, there's definitely that element. But I think that if there's a pattern of saying that, then that's a problem. You know, and even if somebody is saying, even if a child is saying that they want to take their life or they want to die for it to get attention, there's a problem that they're feeling that's the way to get attention. So either way, I would say that's something I would want to seek some professional input about. I would want to talk with a mental health professional about that. You know, if they are seriously thinking about self harm or suicide, then they need help with that. On the flip side, if they're doing it to seek attention, they need to learn some healthier ways to get attention.
We've got one final question for you,
Yep.
Dr. Shepard. Would a self-interrupted attempt at suicide be considered self-harm, or is this treated as a true suicide attempt?
I think it goes back to that intent to die. If the person, you know, and it's hard for us to tell because we don't. It's hard for us to know the intent of the person. But if the person had the intent to end their life, then that would be classified as a suicide attempt.
Okay.
Dr. Shepard, I have a question. Just
Yeah.
some idea for parents if they find out or somebody calls them and says, "Hey, I want you to let you know that your child is cutting or
Uh-huh.
self-harming," how to go about talking to the child and encouraging to go get help. How does
Mm-hmm.
got any suggestions for parents there?
You know, I think that, I mean, obviously there may be some differences based on, you know, individual family situations and relationships with kids, but I do feel like you know, being honest, I think that, you know, I probably would you know, depending on the person who informed me, if it were me, I would have to make a decision about whether I said who told me how I got this information. But, you know, definitely going to your child and saying, hey, you know, in a non-threatening, non-blaming way, but just to say, hey, you know, somebody has let me know that this is going on, and I'm really worried about you, and I want to understand, you know, what's going on and what we do to get you some help.
Okay, thank you.
And, you know, being prepared for any kind of response. I mean, you never know what you're going to get, but I think that it's not something I would want to sit on. I would want to, and part of that is just modeling that open communication. That,
Hmm.
hey, I have this information. I'm worried about you. I'm putting my cards on the table.
Okay, great. Well,
Yep.
thank you. Okay, thank you again, Dr. Shepard, for everything
Mm-hmm.
and staying on and answering all these questions. We really
Sure.
appreciate it. As we close this out, just a reminder of our next webinar. You can go on to operationparent.org now and go ahead and register for that. Also, once I end this webinar, you will receive a short survey. It'll probably just take a minute of your time. If you could go ahead and just answer a few questions, it just helps us with our future programming and understanding how to better serve you. And Dr. Shepard, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and the great information. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I'm going to go ahead and shut off the webinar. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.